All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're actually starting a few minutes earlier than usual, so that's a good thing. It can give us a little bit more time to run through and go through our little deal there. Hebrews chapter 5 is where we're going to be. Hebrews chapter 5. Now, there's nothing like preaching a sermon on Barabbas, and you reach the end and you realize you just preached a sermon on Barnabas. Has that ever happened to y'all? Never happened to me. He's one of those B guys in there, somewhere in there. All right, we are in Hebrews chapter 5. You'll notice each one of these chapters raises up a little bit more, pointing more to Jesus and pointing more towards the responsibility we have in following Jesus. The climax or the high point, what everything in Hebrews is pointing towards is chapter 10. And that's really where we're after. And so you'll notice we keep more or less layering up as we go across. Chapter 1, Jesus is greater than the angels. Chapter 2, Jesus is greater than Moses. Chapter 3, we see how we need to follow because of what happened to the people in Israel. Chapter 4, we see that even more clearly. Now, chapter 5, we begin introducing how Jesus is greater than Joshua, and Jesus is greater than the priesthood. And we're going to go into that in chapter 6 a little bit more as we talk about Melchizedek, and the reason why Jesus follows in the order of Melchizedek rather than the order of Aaron. And we're going to compare that as we get through. Not so much this week, but next week, Lord willing, as we get into that area. And of course, in the end of chapter 5 to chapter 6, verse 11, we take kind of a break from that and talk about maturity, Christian maturity, and how we grow as Christians. But as we go here, we're going to talk about the peril of immaturity, is what I entitled the lesson. But it's also, really, the majority of the chapter is the introduction of Jesus as high priest and why it's important for us to have him as our high priest. Just getting started today, what was the purpose of the high priest in the Old Testament? Do you remember? Oftentimes when I've studied the book of Hebrews in a class, I'll spend about 2 or 3 weeks and we'll run through the book of Leviticus. I didn't do that this time. But what did the high priest do in the old law, in the old covenant? Yeah. Especially on the Day of Atonement, it was his job to make atonement for sins. You recall, let's think of this as a tabernacle, okay? Or we'll think of this as the temple once Solomon comes, okay? As you look around the temple, there are different things, and each thing really points to Jesus. But the Jews would be very aware of this. Say the entrance is right here. People would be coming in at this area. If the entrance is right here, what you would have at this area is the altar of incense. And this is where different oils, different smelly stuff, that's the technical term for it, would be lit. And this would be the altar of incense, which would allow up a certain measure of smoke, and it would fill the entire room with a kind of a fog, kind of a smoke, which would be going on, okay? Now, as you pass that point, on the right-hand side is a table of showbread, and you would have 12 loaves, and it's kind of the idea of Thanksgiving, right? Each loaf would represent one of the tribes. Each loaf would represent the blessings which God had given Israel, okay? Now, on this side, you would have what the Jews considered to be their symbol, right? The candelabra, the candle that would have each one, it'd have each one of those lights which would be there. It'd be running off the olive oil, correct? So, about at this area, you would have the altar. And the altar is where the sheep, where the lambs, the goats, and the bulls would be offered up. And of course, it was unhewn stone. It wasn't made fancy like the Gentiles would do. But it was unhewn stone, had 4 horns, and this is where they would do the sacrifices. Now, back in this area, a little bit further back, would be a huge curtain. We'd almost call it a wall because the curtain was between 8 and 12 inches thick. You imagine, it would be impossible to move around. And behind that is what? The Holy of Holies. And so in that point is where the Ark of the Covenant would be. And that is where people would not be able to enter. Now, why was it a curtain rather than a wall? So that the incense could be smelt from inside, from where the ark was. And so the blood could be seen from that was on the floor, and also the smells of the burning bulls and goats and dove and everything else could be there at the altar as well. Now, once a year, the Day of Atonement, everybody in Israel had to fast. We talk about fasting a lot in the Old Testament. They were commanded to do it one day a year. That was the Day of Atonement. That's when the sacrifice was. And so what would happen is every person in that day would fast. They would have the scapegoat, and then they would have the big offering, which was there. The high priest, the one who was in the family, who was appointed high priest, he would take that blood, and he would walk into the holy place, and he would sprinkle it over the altar. And that was for his own sins. Then he'd come back out, dip his hand back into that bucket, back into the laver that had that blood, go again, and then he would offer it for all of the people as he said a certain prayer. And depending on what era of the life of Israel we're talking about, he would oftentimes recite one of the Psalms as a prayer. And so that's what would go on. Now, of course, on a Day of Atonement, when the high priest went back there, the ark was such a holy place that they would really crank up the altar of incense to fill the entire place up with smoke, so that the priest, when he went back in that area, would not be able to see clearly. Because, see, that was a holy place where God dwelt. That's the reason the cherubim were upon the ark. Symbolically, God dwelt there. And so the priest is very careful when he went back to that area, and it would be filled with smoke. All right. So that's a little bit of what the high priest did. Symbolically, he was the go-between for all of the people and God. And throughout the Old Testament, you always see this happening, don't you? When Israel received the 10 Commandments, did everybody in the entire nation go up on a mountain? No. 40 of the elders and Joshua went halfway up as representatives. And then who went up on the mountain? Moses. And he spent all those days up there. All right? So God oftentimes has used one spokesman or one representative or one person to be the mediator. Now that we've received the New Testament, instead of having a person, who is our mediator? It's Jesus Christ. There's one God, one mediator between God and man, and that is the man, Christ Jesus. All right, that's the background of what we're working with. If you want to read a little closer, more closely, Leviticus chapter 16. But let's go ahead and start here in chapter 5 and verse 1. For every high priest taken among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he might offer both gifts and sacrifices for sin. He can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is also subject to weaknesses. All right, he's taken among men, and he also has compassion. The two traits needed. First of all, he has to be one of them. You can't represent somebody very well unless you're one of them, right? And secondly, he has to be a person who has compassion. Now, how does Jesus fill both of those? Was Jesus ever a man? All right. One of the neatest verses of the New Testament is in John chapter 1. Let's go ahead and skip over to John chapter 1. John 1:14. Okay. And the Word, the Logos there, represents Christ. The Word became flesh, and he dwelt among us. Chapter 1, verse 14. We beheld his glory. The glory is the only begotten, full of grace and truth. Okay. What's it mean that he dwelt among us? Older translations use the word tabernacled. What do we mean by that? He made his home with them. Okay. All right. He moved right in with them and became one of them, right? It's kind of funny, and I don't think I'll embarrass him by talking about it. We were talking to Russell Epperson, the missionary up in Montana here a few weeks ago, and he was talking about the very first person from this congregation he met. Now, of course, he knew Jared, but then he met Jared's father-in-law. Okay? Now, the way they met was he was going up there on a motorcycle, and as he reached Lewistown, he recognized, hey, I know this guy. I know that he's in the church up here. So he just showed up one day. And Russell was talking about him, and Russell said, he's a nice guy. Met him and everything. And he said, but in a few minutes, he was talking to my kids, and he had his feet up in a recliner and was just really having a good time. And it was kind of funny with him talking about that. He said, I hope he's who he says he is. Okay? When you move in with somebody, do you get to know them very well? Wives, especially wives, you get to know your husbands a lot more after marriage, don't you? Before marriage, they're really polite, and they buy you flowers, and they're real sweet. What happens after you get married? Oh, they keep doing the same thing. Absolutely. Absolutely. You ever see a different side of your husband once you get married? And you're like, how did I marry that? Right? But that's what he's talking about there. Not that Jesus was ever, bad in any way, but he dwelt among us. He moved in with us. We saw him when he got up in the morning. We saw him when he was angry. We saw him when he was relaxing. We saw him. He tabernacled among us. He is one of us. He moved in. And that's what John is trying to get across when he opens up his gospel. Also what he's trying to get across when he opens up his first letter, 1 John. When he says we beheld him, we saw him, we touched him, we clung to him. We know Jesus. We know exactly who he is. Okay? Now his compassion. Of course, he's compassionate. Does that mean that he excuses sin? No, it does not. The problem with the high priest has always been in the Old Testament that they could not stand up against sin. They always sinned. First of all, because they were mortal people. And we all have sins which beset us. But also, oftentimes the high priest is a failure. Aaron saw his brother go up on that mountain. He saw all the peals of thunder. He saw all the lightning. He saw the smoke. And here he was, used to Egypt, now in the middle of the wilderness. Now the leader is gone. And the people come to him and say, hey, listen, we kind of like those gods we had back in Egypt. They were pretty cool. And we're a lot more comfortable if we're able to see a god, if we're able to make a god. And so what did Aaron do? Yeah, had all the men bring their earrings. Always sounded weird to me. Had all the men bring their earrings, and he made the golden calf. He couldn't stand up to peer pressure. Everybody said, hey, we need to change and do it this way. And he didn't stand up for what was right, and he went ahead and let that happen. Another example, 1 Samuel chapter 1. You got a fellow named Eli. Eli was a fairly righteous man, but he had two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and they were very unrighteous. They were sleeping with women, even in the tabernacle. They were bullying a lot of the people who were bringing forth sacrifices and belittling those who are trying to worship properly. Did Eli discipline his children? No. He was trying to hold Israel to a standard that he wouldn't hold his own family to. And that's a sin. That's a shortcoming which he has. And we could go through many of the high priests throughout the history of Israel and see the shortcomings which they had. Now, Jesus is a man of compassion. And so he feels for us. He loves us, but he loves us properly. He doesn't love us to the point of not bothering us. True love shows discipline, doesn't it? And true love holds the truth. We read in Proverbs that if you love your son, you're going to what? You're going to discipline your son. All right. And he was subject to weakness. What do we mean when we talk about Jesus being subject to weakness? He never sinned, but how was he subject to weakness? He was tempted. The devil himself appeared to him in Matthew chapter 4, didn't he? In John 6, he felt rejection. When he was in Gethsemane, he wrestled, knowing what was about to happen, both physically and spiritually. Absolutely, he got tired. He got tired, he got hungry, he got thirsty, he felt rejection. You name it. Whatever it is you're going through, Jesus has been there. We oftentimes joke in John 13 about the shortest verse in the Bible, right? Jesus wept, right? Anytime you send kids home and say you got to memorize a verse, they come back and say what? Jesus wept, okay? 2 words. But that verse is super pregnant with meaning. It is full of meaning. Because imagine the Son of God crying because he lost a loved one. Even Jesus grieves. Even Jesus cries. There's nothing wrong with us feeling that way. All right, now let's look at verse 3. Because of this, he is required as for the people and also for himself to offer sacrifices for sin. Okay, he's talking about the high priest here. And no man takes his honor to himself, but he who is called by God, just as Aaron is called by God. Okay, let's first of all talk about the false teaching here. A lot of religious groups, denominations, believe that you have to be called to preach. If you talk to a denominational preacher, he oftentimes will tell you about his call. Okay? Does God specifically call a person to preach? I don't think he does in a way in which people talk about. You know, there's this old country preacher, and he really wasn't any good. He was one of those guys that would put everybody to sleep, you know? People would want to buy his tapes. This is back before tapes. But they'd want to buy tapes of his sermon so they could listen to it and sleep at night. He was a horrible preacher. And he was telling people one day that he had been called to preach. He said, I was out in the cotton field, and I looked up, and the clouds said, what is it? GPC. And that meant, go preach Christ. And he said, so therefore I'm here. And one of the people in the back of the auditorium who was tired of how bad this preacher stood up and said, no, sir. What God was saying was, go pick cotton. Don't go preach Christ. Go pick cotton. That's what you're called to do. Okay? Some people say, I've been called to preach. Now, if a person believes he's called to preach, it doesn't matter if he is bad at it or good at it, he has to preach. It doesn't matter if he gets a different job, he has to preach. He is required by God to preach. Now, very few people believe that. Oftentimes they'll change, get a job here, get a job there, or whatever else, and they just get called to do whatever they're wanting to do. Are we called to preach? No. Huh? Well, yeah, all of us in a certain way, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Acts 8:4, everybody is to spread the word, everybody is to teach, and that's going to be a great segue to the end of this chapter. Each of us are called to maturity to preach Christ. But as far as the role of evangelist, who should be an evangelist? All of us. But as far as the official role, those people have a fire in their bones, right? Jeremiah chapter 20 and verse 9, Jeremiah says, I wasn't going to preach anymore. I was tired of the way people were treating me. But there was a fire in my bones, and I just had to do it. Preaching is not the easiest job in the world. It's not the most glamorous job in the world. There's a lot of parts of preaching that are tough. But we need to raise more preachers in the Lord's church, don't we? That's something which is desperately, desperately needed. We got to get more preachers. And we got to get people, I don't know how to say this well. I'm going to try. Y'all can correct me to say it better. There are too many preachers in the Lord's church who preach because there's nothing else they can do. You know what I mean? And that makes the church weaker. We need to take our best men and make them preachers rather than our worst men. You get what I'm saying? Does that make sense? You got to get your good guys. You know, a lot of people raise their boys, they raise their children, and they say, hey, I want you to be a doctor. I want you to be a lawyer. I want you to be this or that. And when we do that, what is it we're looking at? I want you to be rich to pay for my retirement. You know? We need to get our best young men to preach because that's what drives the kingdom in many ways. That's what drives the kingdom. But I think that's off subject. I'm not sure why I got there. Oh, the call to preach. Okay. Let's look at some of the men who are called to be priests. Aaron was called to be a priest. Remember in Exodus chapter 4, Moses said, I cannot speak well. I love that because we see in the first 5 books of the Bible, which Moses wrote, we see 18 words spoken by Aaron. Okay? How much did Moses speak? The boy wouldn't shut up sometimes, would he? It's what we might say. The entire book of Deuteronomy is what? It's a sermon by Moses. Y'all think y'all got a bad ear. That's 31 chapters. And they stood the whole time, right? Okay. Aaron was called. Aaron had 2 sons, right? But they were destroyed. Eleazar took over. Then we have Phinehas. Okay. Now, Phinehas, I believe, is the man who wrote Joshua. I think that's who wrote Joshua, and I think that's who wrote much of the book of Judges as well. But we'll study that when we get there. And it was that family, the Phinehas family, which through the ages began to be high priests. Now, it changed dynasties or changed families when we get to David, and then it began to change more and more, and especially once we get to the time of Babylon and the time of Rome, it started switching around a lot more because it became corrupted more or less. The one who was called outside the family of Phinehas would be Samuel. Eli was a failure. Samuel took over that role for a short time. He was the last judge, a center point, if you will, of the Old Testament. And when you study the Old Testament, he's kind of the spoke of the wheel. Pretty interesting when you look at it, see how he fills those 3 roles. But once Samuel died, did his children take over the priesthood? No. It went back to the family of Phinehas as we go through. All right. Now, the reason that's interesting is you and I go through that, and I probably should have developed a PowerPoint because it's interesting. We don't study the family line of the high priest very well sometimes in the church because, we're interested in other things, the kingship and the line of David and things such as that. But throughout this period, when the high priest was called, a lot of other people would say, no, wait a second. I'm tired of listening to you. I want to be in charge for a while. We never hear that in the church, do we? Oh, yeah, we hear that in the church a lot. Korah. Now, how was Korah related to Moses and Aaron? He's a nephew, okay? So he was sort of in that family of high priests, but he didn't exactly fit it. Korah and about 3 others stood up to Moses and they said, listen, we're tired of you always being in charge and your family always being in charge. We think that God needs to speak through us and we need to go back to Egypt. And so God said, interesting. Everybody on Korah's side stand on that side. Everybody on Moses' and Aaron's side stand over here. Which way would you go? When God says that, you follow Moses, right? People who followed Korah, what happened to them? The earth opened up and swallowed them. Okay? All right. Saul was waiting on Samuel. The Philistines were bearing against him. He was losing his army. Samuel wasn't there exactly the time he wanted him to be, exactly in the way that he wanted him to be. And Saul was beginning to panic. And so Saul thought, man, I'm king. I'm going to go ahead and offer the sacrifice. And so Saul usurped Samuel's place, began to offer the sacrifice. And that's when Samuel showed up and said, because of the way that you're disobedient, you're going to lose your kingdom. And that's the first time in which that was prophesied. You also have Uzziah. What happened to Uzziah? He offered incense. The prophet spoke against him, and he put out his hand, and he got leprosy. Spent the rest of his life with leprosy. Okay? It's also the king during the days of Isaiah, who died at the very beginning of Isaiah. Okay, and Jeroboam is really different. Remember, he got rid of all the Levites because he's in the northern kingdom, and he decided to make his own people to be Levites. Anybody could do it. Anybody could be that way. We're going to move it back. The day of the Passover, we're going to move it back 2 months so the harvest could be done. Yes, sir. Yeah.
The Levites were called to serve in the tabernacle.
Right.
They were not all priests.
Right.
Aaron
Good. Yeah, absolutely. What Dan just said is, remember, we oftentimes kind of group them all together. The Levites were priests, but not all Levites. The priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. You had Aaron, and you had Eleazar, and then you had Phinehas, okay? If you were in the family, there's 3 brothers left, by the way. If you were in the Phinehas family, you were the priesthood. If you were in the other ones, under Levi and under Aaron, you fulfilled different roles. Some were singers, some were servers. Everybody in the tribe of Levi filled a certain role, but they weren't all priests. They would run the cities of refuge. They would run in many ways as judges over the people, but they didn't fill all those roles. So that's a good point to make when you're studying in the Old Testament. Not all Levites were priests. That's very true. Okay, so we go through there and we see that they had to be called by God. So the point the Hebrew writer here is making in chapter 3 and 4 is that somebody couldn't just set themselves up as priests. They had to be chosen specifically by God. So now verse 5. And we get really creative here as we go through it, using these scriptures. So also Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." And he also says, verse 6, in another place, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who is able to save him from death, and he was heard because of godly fear." Okay, two passages out of Psalms to prove that Jesus is high priest today. The first one, Psalm chapter 2 and verse 7, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." Does that mean that's the day that Jesus is born? No, Jesus is eternal. So what's it mean, I have begotten you? It's a hard question, isn't it? It means you're chosen, you're appointed as high priest. Before the beginning of the creation of the world, before the beginning of the creation of the universe, God had already planned the plan of salvation. He knew that we would sin, and he had already planned to send his son down to this earth to die for us. The love, imagine the love required of that. To build a creation that you know will one day cause your son to die. That's how much God loves you. But see, the point that the Hebrew writer is making here is God is specifically chosen. God specifically chose Jesus for each and every one of us. Now, the other passage quoted, and we'll really get into this next week, Lord willing, Psalm 110. "You are a priest of the order of Melchizedek." Now, who is Melchizedek? We won't get into it too deeply because we're going to work on it quite a bit next week, Lord willing. Who is Melchizedek? See him in the book of Genesis? Huh? Yeah, he's hanging out with Abraham. Okay? He's the king of a city called Salem. It means peace. Salem, a little bit later, is going to have the name of Jehu. That is a shortened form of Jehovah, we would call it, Yahweh. Put before it, the God of peace. Jerusalem turns into what in our English language? Jerusalem, okay? There is a righteous king over Salem. Abraham goes and saves Lot. Remember, somebody had captured Lot and all of Sodom and hauled him into slavery. Abraham goes with his army, and he destroys them and frees Lot and frees Sodom so they can return home. And as he's coming back, he stops by a priest named Melchizedek, who is over a city of God named Salem. Now, it's crazy stuff because we don't really know who in the world Melchizedek is. We don't see where he came from, and we don't see whatever happens to him. There's a reason for that. We're going to see that next week. Melchizedek was a person just like us. He did have a birth date, did have a death date, but I think specifically God didn't put that in Scripture because of what Melchizedek is going to represent in the next two chapters. And it's just fascinating stuff when we go through it. But like I said, Lord willing, that's next week's stuff. We've got Melchizedek right here. Now, why is it important that Jesus come through Melchizedek instead of coming through Aaron? Aaron was a priest of what covenant? The old law, okay? And so for Jesus to be a priest in the old law, he couldn't be from the tribe of Judah, right? He'd have to be of the tribe of what? Levi. So proof, which will come in 2 chapters later, that the Old Testament is done away with is the fact that our high priest now comes from Judah. Now, Jeroboam destroyed the old law in the northern kingdom because he took the high priesthood away from Levi and gave it to Ephraim and Manasseh. And so they went off in their own way, and God destroyed them. Now, the new law is created because God has now taken the priesthood away from Levi and given it to Judah. The scepter has gone to Judah and has never left. And so the old law is done away with. You cannot follow Jesus and claim to follow the Old Testament because our high priest is not a Levite. You cannot follow Christianity and say we're still under the Old Covenant because Jesus cannot fall in the line of Phineas. It can't happen. It just doesn't work. It's like me a lot of times trying to work on something around the house. I end up trying to hammer something with a screwdriver, and I end up trying to turn a wrench with a hammer because I can't find my tools. I can't find what I need. And so the things that I work with don't work very well. That's what's happening when Christians try to bring up the old law because that's done away with, and that's done. And we'll get there eventually. We will get there. But this is the first introduction of Melchizedek, and we're about to get deeply into that in chapter 6 and chapter 7. But the point here, two qualifications. First of all, is Jesus chosen by God? Yes. Secondly, if he's a Melchizedek, is Jesus among the people of this earth? Yes. That's the 2 points he's bringing out in introduction. Okay. Jesus is our high priest. He had flesh and blood nature. He had human weakness without sin. And he brings up this point here. Let me find verse 7. He had offered up prayers and supplication with vehement cries and tears to him. Now, we talk about manliness. When you're trying to describe somebody as a manly dude, how do you describe him? I say he doesn't wear pink. That didn't work out too well for me. Okay? You talk about a guy being a man by his muscles, right? By his strength and vitality, right? When the Hebrew writer is talking about Jesus as a man, what does he bring up? There in verse 7. He cried. Okay? That's a key point to show that Jesus was upon this earth. Now, we're a happy society. We always want to look to the positive. We always want to look to the happiness. We always want to be rejoicing. But what happens if you live upon this earth? Are there going to be some days that are pretty sorry? Absolutely. All who wish to live godly in Christ Jesus will face what? Okay. Man who is born of woman, Job would say, is what? Full of sorrows and troubles, right? If you live upon this earth, you're going to cry. There's going to be days that are not good. That's what this earth is about. Now, there are good things on this earth, and there are good things of life. I like life. But to prove the humanness of Jesus, the writer of Hebrews says, he cried. He cried. That shows how real he is. And that shows how he, in many ways, applies to each and every one of us. Now, verse 8. Verse 8 is so key, right? Yet, even though he were a son, he also learned what? Obedience. All right. Do you have to obey God? A lot of people say you don't obey God. God gives you salvation. You don't have to obey. Do you have to obey God? Jesus obeyed God, right? Yet, though he were a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered, became perfected, became the author of eternal salvation to all who believe in him, to all who obey him, called by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, of whom we have much to say and hard to explain. Boy, 11 is an understatement. Since you have become dull of hearing. Okay. Jesus learned obedience, right? Okay. Philippians 2, beginning of verse 5. Your attitude, your mind should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a man, right? And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself, became obedient to death, even the death that was on the cross. So he learned obedience his entire life, from his birth to his resurrection to his ascension, was all obedience. That's what's so interesting about Jesus. How many prophecies did he fulfill during his life? At least 300. Okay? Imagine that. Imagine the checklist that you have. Does your wife ever give you a checklist when you go to Walmart? My wife used to, but she gave up. Okay? Imagine if your spouse or if your parent gave you a checklist of 300 things and said, go to Walmart and get every one of these. That would be hard, wouldn't it? Jesus came to this earth and had a checklist of 300 prophecies he had to fulfill. Everything about Jesus was obedience. How he would enter into Jerusalem, how he would speak these things, who he would talk to, how he would speak, where he would go, his miracles, his teachings, everything was fulfillment. Everything Jesus did was obedience. And so here we see the power of this high priest who is first and foremost obedient to God. Okay? And he acts on behalf of men in relation to God, and he reveals the intentions. Okay, we're going back to linking to this as being the tabernacle or the temple. 2 points of a high priest. First of all, you go to God and you offer that sacrifice over the altar on behalf of the people. Now that was the job in the Day of Atonement. The rest of the days, 364, his job was to go from God and tell the people, this is how you live. This is the God you worship. This is how you need to act. So the high priest worked both ways, from the people to God and from God to the people. Jesus in the same way works both ways. He's our advocate before the Father, but he's also the one who speaks for us or speaks to us. He speaks for us and he speaks to us as well. Okay? Jesus acts on behalf of men dying for their sins, and he offers the gifts and sacrifices for sins as well. Now we see there in verse 9, eternal salvation. What's that mean? Was Joshua's salvation eternal? That promised land? No. When the people were unfaithful, they lost it, right? All of God's plan was not done when God had given all the land. That promise to Abraham was twofold. It was a land promise and a spiritual promise. Jesus' promise is an eternal promise, which is here. And then the necessity to obey, to become, and to remain a child of God. The end of Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10, be faithful even unto the point of death, and I will give you what? Crown of life. Excellent. Okay. Now, just like me, the writer of Hebrews gets a little scattered. He goes back and he wants to talk about something real quick, and he'll go from verse 12 to the early part of chapter 6. And he's like, now wait a second, I see you're not paying attention to what he kind of says. Let's take a break because we got to get something straight. Now that's where we are in verse 12. So read with me from 12 to 14. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone again to teach you the first principles, the oracles of God. You've come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are full age, that is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. Okay. Now, verse 12, you ought to be teachers, just like Ed said earlier. Who has a responsibility to teach the gospel? Every single one of us, right? Now, some people say, wait a second, James 3:1, let not many of you become teachers, for you will be under a greater judgment. Okay? Not quite talking about the same thing. We see the responsibility that's placed upon teachers, but James is not saying don't become a teacher, just realize the responsibility that's there. Okay? Every one of us is a teacher. You teach by your example, and you have a responsibility to tell someone else the message of God. Every one of us has that responsibility, which are there, okay? First principles, okay? That word goes back to rudimentary elements. In other words, the foundation of your house, okay? The first principles which are there. What are the first principles? The basics, okay? Now, we define them a little bit later as we go through this book, but what are the basics? Jesus died, was buried, and was resurrected for you. How many churches are there? One church, right? Christ Church, not my church, your church, not a denominational church, not a man's church, not just pick whatever church you want. God's church, okay? Where do you find out about God's church? his book, right? Who's the head of the church? Jesus, okay? Very rudimentary, fundamental principles. Now, what's happening wrong in the church today? We're raising generations that don't know what? The basic principles, okay? Over and over, you'll see surveys done in Christian colleges where 60% of the people who enter into college aren't really sure why the church doesn't use an instrument in its worship. Or they're not really sure what the difference is between the Lord's church and a denomination. Or they're not sure of some of these very basic things. Why is that happening? Okay, parents are expecting the church to teach their children. And the church expects parents to teach their children. So it's not happening either way, okay? And then a lot of times what I think happens is we become too smart and too educated. Now, I believe in education. I went to school, and I think it's a great thing. Time flies when you're having fun. But what happens when we get really, really, really smart? We end up losing what's really most important. Okay, we'll continue here because this is an important part, and then we'll get into next week. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your attention. Hope to see you tonight at 5 o'clock.